Are your parenting strategies helping or hurting your teen's mental health? What biblical principles really work in modern day teen parenting? Is discipline possible with love? Even when your teen tests every boundary? Are you equipping your teen for both emotional maturity and a strong faith foundation? So, for our topic in this episode is all about healthy parenting for teenagers. Hi beloved, this is Doc Gilbert and I'm a Christian clinical counselor and psychologist. So hi guys, how are you? So welcome to our newest episode. So it's our how many episodes do we have? I think we're gonna upload it as the episode 26. And yeah, God has been faithful. You know, it's not easy to really start this YouTube channel. And, my heart is really to help people grow in their understanding of themselves, experience their own healing, that they would come to encounter God and that they would experience Him holistically. And, this is one of the pioneering work in our own ministry that I did. And it has its own struggles, but here we are, and as long as that there is one viewer who would really listen and who would be helped, who would be encouraged to seek counseling or therapy, who would encounter God in this way, you know um that would be a motivation for me to continuously do this. Okay. And yes, aside from that, I really love teaching, imparting my knowledge and wisdom. I've studied for many years. Of course, other than that, I went through with my own healing journey. And yes, I'm continuously healing. But yeah, it's really time to impart and to teach and to educate people, to give what God has given me, generously. And yeah, hopefully in time that, a more tangible fruit would be seen. But I understand as well, when it comes to integration of psychology and theology with Christian mental health, like a combination of faith and science, it's not that famous here in the Philippines and even worldwide. There's always a dichotomy between the two. When we talk about faith, it's all about faith, your spirituality, your relationship of Jesus, but much of it uh, are actually devoid from self-awareness. And of course, I do understand that it is not talked about among churches. The churches are not that equipped yet, are not knowledgeable in that level. But it's okay. That's why we're doing this. But on the other side, the psychology part, it does not embrace much of the Christian doctrine, unless you're a Christian or a Christian educator, a counselor, or a psychologist. But when we look at the academe, the curriculum, the subjects that are being offered, unless it is in the seminary, Christian seminary, there is really no integration of Christian theology with, psychology. Of course, I understand that people have their own beliefs, have their own religious backgrounds, but I do believe in the truth, the absolute truth, which is the Christian theology when we talk about our spirituality. Okay. So yeah, just some thoughts out there. I'm just sharing this, releasing this even through here. But of course, we are going to talk about what it means to really parent teenagers. Of course, one of the most difficult seasons of our lives, not just for those who are already teenagers, but for all of us, right? One of the most intense, most tumultuous, most explorative, most adventurous, most impulsive, okay? And it's just a phase of our lives that we need to navigate and go through. So we're gonna talk about that today. So we're gonna talk about how do we parent teenagers, and I've been doing counseling for many years, and I've handled teenagers in my counseling, so it's a different kind of dynamic. And I'm a coach as well with our badminton club here in Tanza Cavite, and most of our players are actually teenagers, and I have like teenagers I'm actually discipling, you know, currently. So yeah, I can say it's really difficult, compared when I'm doing like counseling with an adult or discipling an adult person with the teenager. There's really like impulsivity in terms of decision making, trying to test my boundary, especially in terms of coaching and discipleship, you know, uh, growing in my relationship with them deeply. you know um they do not have much empathy, you know knowing also that most of these kids are coming from, traumatic backgrounds, coming from abusive homes, toxic families, like separated parents, a lots of trauma here, and yeah, it's really a pioneering work as well to disciple, in a way, coach and counsel this teenagers, this generation. And add up to that is the challenge of the social media. It is more intense, more escalated compared during my time, in the earlier times, right? So there's much technology, it can be easily accessed, the pressure of what's being seen, the media, the influence of it, the beliefs, the culture that is transcending out from the, screen, that these teenagers are watching. So, it's really extra challenge to also parent, in a way, parent, disciple, counsel. It's really a pioneering work for me, here at in our ministry here at Tanza Cavite. And it's challenging, but it's also um, rewarding, to see how these young ones are growing, how they are coming to know God one step at a time. And yeah, I always believe that what we started here, what we planted into the people's lives, it is the Holy Spirit that would grow that, and it's also their own decision, the teenagers' decision as they become adults. But at least, there's some wisdom, impartations, guidance, supervision. So, yeah, and in terms of coaching, discipling, parenting teenagers, we need to understand how they develop, and we need to understand the teenagers' development. Okay? So, first, we need to understand their identity formation. Okay? So, I've written down here, teenagers actually explore who they are due to the prefrontal cortex maturation. So when we talk about prefrontal cortex, it is here. When you touch this forehead, the brain here is the prefrontal cortex, and its role is the executive functioning of the brain. And it's like the CEO of the company, where it directs, it thinks, it analyzes, it supervises. And for the teenagers, these are not yet fully developed. It's in the process of maturation, physically and biologically. And the way to really help that prefrontal cortex to develop more is that us parents would help these teenagers towards their own self-discovery, not by control, which it's actually happening among toxic families, narcissistic families, abusive homes. I've heard a lot of stories here in our ministry at Tanza on how these teenagers are being controlled, manipulated, gaslight, and even abused, well, when we talk about abuse, we talk about control, how these toxic parents are controlling their children to meet their own needs, to project their own pains. And that's actually not helpful to the prefrontal cortex. It's actually damaging. Trauma is damaging to the maturation of the prefrontal cortex. And not just, among the teenagers that we are leading. Even in my counseling, I notice how even adults, they find it hard to see the reality of what they're going through, their own experience, verbalizing their emotions, finding healthy coping, finding healthy relationships, finding safety from within because, the prefrontal cortex was hampered in its maturation due to different traumatic events. Okay? So as these people get to experience healing through counseling, through therapy, as they process their own trauma, this prefrontal cortex gets activated. And just like what I discussed, that due to the trauma and the abuse, the amygdala, the threat center of our brain, gets overly activated, thus turning our prefrontal cortex off. So this kind of guidance, supervision, not controlling these teenagers could actually help the prefrontal cortex to mature, in its biological process. And of course, we need to understand that part of the teenager's development is seeking independence. So the brain reward systems are actually highly active for the teenagers. They want to make their autonomy clear. They would appeal it, even through rebellion. So that's why, as parents, we need to guide them towards making safe choices. We need to supervise them, not feed them, what they need to do, but we can actually, help them see that these are the alternatives. Okay, when they make these choices, and this would be the possible consequences, and in that way, they would learn in boundary setting, how to limit and how to choose wise decisions, healthy and positive actions, that could protect them. Okay. And of course, it's very understandable for us to see that there's a huge influence for them, among their peers. There is peer pressure, as we often hear that. So the adolescent's social brain, meaning the combination of the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, is actually sensitive with their peer approval at this point of their lives. Okay, so it's either whether the peers are actually positive in their influence or negative, it has an impact, because of this the brain structure as of the moment of the teenagers, the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and with that, the sense of wanting to belong, the need to belong, the need for approval from their peers, the need to be loved, when their peers approve them, then it is equated to love. When their peers approve them, then it is equated to self-worth, self-confidence. So much of this like need to feel worthy and love comes from this sense of belonging from their peers. And that's a natural part of their seasons. And that's why we need to model values, meaning in our home, we need to show what we prioritize. We need to set boundary. We need to assert our feelings or like resolve conflict in a healthy way. And we need to actually foster critical thinking. And I usually do this a lot with the teenagers that I'm coaching and discipling, and even in counseling, um, I help them to grow in their critical thinking, like by asking question, when you did this, uh, for example, when a person did this to you, referring to the specific action that this teenager did, what message would it communicate to you? And then what would it make you feel? And what would be the impact of that in your relationship, in your self image, in your functioning? Okay, so I usually ask these questions to foster critical thinking, and in that way you are actually helping them and teaching them to do the same way, to think before they act on their impulses. And of course, the prefrontal cortex is being developed through those process of helping them, in critical thinking. And of course, it empowers them to make their own choices with wisdom, with the critical thinking rather than go with the impulses immediately. They can actually like hold that and be empowered to create and make a healthy choice. Okay, so emotional regulation among teenagers are, is not much present, because the limbic system develops faster than the prefrontal cortex. So the limbic system handles the survival and intense emotions, and yes, that's why when they feel something, like for example in terms of romantic relationship, that's why there's many like teenage pregnancy, they just act on the impulse. They do not have much self-control. They go towards the flow of their emotional intensity. So and what could help them is we teach them with coping strategies, here in doing counseling and in parenting and discipling teenagers. I teach them mindfulness skills. Mindfulness would help us, to destabilize and activate our amygdala and to bring our body, brain, and mind into safety. So there are a lot of mindfulness practices that you can teach, and you can like demo it and then lead them to do it. You can join with them as you practice this, so that there would be experiential way, on how to do it. And yes, that could help them, to regulate and manage difficult emotions. Of course, how would they know about mindfulness if, no one would teach them, right? So in that way, you are like adding tools in their toolbox, so that when there would be intense emotions, impulses, they can like get some of these tools and use it for themselves. Okay, so of course, empathic listening is very important. There are a lot of studies that empathy actually destabilizes amygdala. It makes a person feel safe, heard, seen, and thus, the nervous system would calm and be in the safe mode. And not just that, like there are a lot of studies that shows that empathy, heals physical illnesses, reduces inflammation among our organs. It teaches cooperation, empowers the child to really be cooperative and collaborative. So there's so much power in empathy. We're gonna discuss that more in one of our episodes. So we need to be empathic. We need to validate their feelings, even if it's hard for us to listen. When especially when they're angry towards us, they're disappointed. But through empathy, they're able to regulate their emotions and not deny it, not reject it. You know, and of course, in connection with that, all these processes could lead to self-awareness. So our brains have what we call neuroplasticity, and among teenagers the neuroplasticity is high. Do you know that? And early support in their stress, in their conflict, in their intense emotional experiences, and even in trauma, you know could prevent long-term issues. So, you know, that's a very important process for them, and for them to maximize the neuroplasticity in a good way. So on the other hand, without all this kind of support, empathy, boundary, critical thinking, the neuroplasticity would be wired towards toxic pattern, and thus it becomes a data, on how they would do in their adult relationships. Again, how we do in our adult relationships come from the pattern that we built for many years, especially among teenagers, so we go with what is familiar with us. If what is familiar to the teenager is scolding, physically beating them up, or sexual abuse, or no boundary, no empathy, then they would go in that kind of adult relationships growing up. They would do that in their own parenting. And we want to stop that cycle among the teenagers, by being not the perfect parent, but being the healthy parent that God wants us to be. So, what are the practical steps in parenting among teenagers? I know I discussed some in our previous point, but one of the effective strategies is effective communication. So we can engage the teenagers' prefrontal cortex by asking an open-ended questions, and then by listening actively, so that we can build upon the trust, the connection, the bonding, and so that we would be able to reflect and empathize and validate their feelings. Okay, so like, use questions like, what would, what message could uh you possibly send through this, what message would come across to you, what would you feel, what would you think, what would be the impact of that in our relationship, in your relationship, what would be the impact of that in your adulthood. So we use open-ended questions to engage with the prefrontal cortex, and in that way we are also teaching them empathy, as they grow in their understanding critically on what would be the impact of their choices towards others and towards themselves. We are honing empathy among them. And when we talk about empathy, it's tuning in and wearing the shoes of that person, being the world of that person, in order for us to understand them. And without this, they would not be able to really learn empathy. And in that effective communication, we also model assertiveness, meaning we use "I feel anger because you did this," you model that towards them. And then you also teach them what made you feel angry, so then you may like guide them like, "I feel angry because," so that in that way they are learning healthy expression of their feelings and of their experience. Okay, and then of course, you validate and empathize, and in that way you are also teaching them how to validate and empathize too. And of course, when we talk about effective communication, if we as parents we did wrong, we need to apologize. So after empathizing, you must apologize. "I'm sorry I made you feel this way. Although it's not my heart to do this, but I'm sorry. I will do better. I hear you that this was the impact of what I did, what I said." So in that way, we are also teaching them humility, that they can actually make mistake and correct that, and they can admit that towards one another. You're also teaching them accountability in a way that when we make mistakes, it's not like we go away and like dismiss that, rationalize that, and we can like that they can learn to admit their mistakes and apologize as part of the accountability. And of course, we need to set boundaries with love. Okay? So boundary is putting limit and explaining why you put that limit. For example, with the players that I'm coaching, when if they are late, there is a certain consequence uh, with regards to that, as a form of penalty or like discipline. And of course, before explaining, I would like use analogy and, engage with their prefrontal cortex. For example, if you are on my shoes, what message would it sends to you? And what would you feel? What would you see the impact of that? And then I would reflect back that, with what you did, for example, being late, that's how I felt. That would be the impact of that. So in that way, you are like not just teaching critical thinking, but setting boundary with love, that you are not enabling their toxic trait or their wrongdoings to perpetuate, to grow. You are just trimming down this, you know, uh, unhealthy, not beneficial branches, thorns, in order for the, real branches and stems to grow. So yeah, it teaches healthy executive functioning and decision making. So it's very important that we discipline them by giving them, the rightful consequence, and which is very far from, the quote unquote discipline, but in reality, children are being abused, physically, emotionally, psychologically, in our culture today, where it is actually like idealized as a way to correct behaviors. And we're going to talk more about those kinds of abuses in the coming episode. But it's very, far from what is healthy discipline looks like. Okay, so that's what healthy discipline looks like. We set boundary by helping them, correct their behavior with the consequences, that they would like not repeat that behavior because it is harmful, it is toxic. Okay. And of course, that correction, it's not a form of punishment, but it actually activates a learning circuit in our brain, in the teenager's brain, which actually helps the long-term development of it, biologically. Okay. And in that way, we also foster resilience, with the critical thinking, asking them open-ended questions, setting boundaries with consequences, listening with empathy, validating them. They are learning problem solving and conflict resolution. They're also learning how to cope, with stressors, with mistakes, with the problems in the future, that they would like have this mindfulness to pause in a way before having their decisions or actions. Okay. And in that way, it strengthens the neural pathways for stress regulation. Okay. Yeah. And, teaching critical thinking actually also challenges assumptions that they have, with teenagers, because their prefrontal cortex are not yet developed. So there are a lot of assumptions, perceptions. So it's very important as part of clear communication to discuss this consequence and why it is necessary. Involve teenager through the reasoning, like by asking the open-ended question and, reflecting it back to them, so that, they would realize that this consequence is connected, and it does matter with what they're doing or what they did. And it would, develop the higher order cognition and their moral development, which is, it would be their moral compass along the way, as they become adults in the future. And of course, as Christians, all these things are actually practical picture of a Christ-like character. When we extend patience, empathy, integrity, we mirror that neural pattern of pro-social behavior towards them. Thus, we are also mirroring Christ-likeness. Of course, we would not be a perfect parent. There would be no perfect parent, but there can be consistent, secure, healthy, growing, maturing, and self-aware parent. And that's, I hope that these parents are striving for. Yes, you may came from a traumatic background, but trauma does not have the last word in your life. You can heal as a parent. I like what Dr. Shefali is discussing in conscious parenting, and I agree with that. We may have all these education seminars, strategies, techniques as parents, and all those things are good. Don't get me wrong. Um, but without understanding ourselves, without growing in our self awareness, healing our own trauma, understanding how our toxic pattern, our family dynamics are actually contributing on how we parent our kids today, then it would all be nothing. We would not understand the triggers. We would react. We would just repeat the pattern. So it starts with us. I want to add that here, that it's very important that us parents, we engage in an ongoing self-awareness and healing. And in that way, we would be attuned to what's going on in our teenagers. We would not easily react, although it's normal to react sometimes because we are not perfect. We are just human beings. But with self-awareness, we would be able to build an authentic connection with our teenagers today. So, in conclusion, parenting teenager is really hard. It would trigger a lot of wounds from the past. When you were a teenager, it would trigger trauma, your father wound, your mother wound, some layers of grief, because our teenagers, these teenagers, are the mirrors of our past. So we get to see, the ideal parts of us, and the parts that we grieve, the parts that are unresolved, the parts that we hate. That's why relationships are mirrors. That's why in relationship we project our issues, we displace, we release our pent up and buried negative emotions. We play out the pattern from the past, our unconscious experiences coming out in the adult relationships. And the teenagers would be a reflection of the good and the bad of us. So that's why it's really hard, especially combined with that, all these tumultuous, impulsive, intense emotions that these teenagers are going through. So that's why it requires empathy. It requires boundary. It requires, education and continuous learning. It requires support as well for you, as a parent of a teenager. But most importantly, it requires an ongoing self-awareness and healing. That you would engage in understanding yourself. Thus, as a result, as a fruit, you would increase your emotional attunement towards your teenager. You would increase your emotional capacity in handling difficult impulses and emotions that these teenagers are experiencing. And besides, that's what Jesus would do. When, the disciples are impulsive, sinning, reckless, mess up, Jesus has so much empathy, patience, compassion, and even a lot of critical thinking, using metaphors in his studies, and even boundary, for these people that he is discipling during that time. Okay? So that's it, beloved. I hope that you've learned something. So if you have insights, reflections, awareness, please do comment down below. And if you know a parent, or if you are also a teenager, and you know someone who might be needing this to hear, please do share the link, of this video. And if you're new here, welcome. Please do subscribe, and by subscribing in our YouTube channel, you're all actually helping the Intimacy Philippines to bring more healing among Filipinos and beyond. Okay? So I hope to see you in our next episode. Hanggang sa muli.